To the afternoon session. I hope you are enjoying the proceedings so far, and there are more exciting topics to come. So we are going to start the second session of ASEAN at 50, looking back and moving forward. For this topic, we are delighted to be joined by four distinguished panelists who are experts with lots of experiences. They are here with me on stage already, and I would like to introduce them to you. First, Professor Tan See Seng, Deputy Director, Institute of Defense and Strategic Study, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RC Singapore. And the second, Dr. Shafan Albana Korasat, Executive Secretary, ASEAN Studies Center, University of Indonesia, Indonesia. And third, Associate Professor Herman Joseph Kraft, Institute for Strategic and Development Studies, or ISDS, Philippines. And our last panelist, Mr. Johar, former Chairman and Chief Executive, Institute of Strategic and International Study, or ISIS, Malaysia. And our moderator for this session will be Assistant Professor Akarapong Kamkoon, Pridi Panomyong International College, Thammasat University. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Okay, you want me to start now? Good afternoon, everybody. Speaking the afternoon after lunch is like a struggle to something very difficult. So I think we would make this session to be more ease and more enjoyable by, let our panelists express the idea of what should be the next 50 years, I would say, because Dr. Prapat, assigned this question to me, and this like I am his students. So since yesterday, we have listened to the very good speech by our minister, His Excellency Don Paramat Vinay. I think it's quite very, very significant when he reminded us of the first three letter C's, three C's. When it was the formation of ASEAN, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations, we start with cooperation, right? The first is cooperation. The second one is consultation. And the last one is consensus. Then we move forward to the ideas of another three C's when we had a charter. So the first C is community building, right? So we are now building the community with the ideas of connectivity. That is the second C. And the last one that we, like Professor Prapat usually give me a lecture in the classroom, we talk about ASEAN centrality. That the minister said, if our panelists could propose another three C's or anything that we are going to like our destination for the next 50 years, it would be complimentary. It would be very happy for Thailand to go following that kind of concepts. And the Ministry of Thai Foreign Affairs will provide you with a very honorary tokens or something, even our audience. Right?
Already in Phuket.
Yes, sir, already in Phuket. So, I think we should start from, if you can notice, our panelists, including me, are the founding members of ASEAN countries, right? Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. So what should be the next step of ASEAN? This is my question to Your Excellency. I shall start from Professor Tan See Seng. He is the Deputy Director of the Institutes of Defense and Strategy Studies, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. Please welcome Dr. Tan See Seng.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to one and all. Good afternoon to you. My gratitude as well to Dr. Prapat and to the to Thammasat University for involving me in this meeting. You know, this morning we heard a couple of stories of on origins of how ASEAN came to be, and I thought, since I allegedly represent one of the founding members of ASEAN, although I don't speak with any official capacity, that I should also add my own origin story, whether it's apocryphal or not, I'm not entirely sure, but let me just say that it bears mentioning that even though Singapore is a founding member, Singapore almost did not make it into ASEAN back in 1967, particularly when we failed to make the invitation list to the meeting in Bang Seng. And it is indeed thanks to Tanak Koman that Singapore, you know, the last-minute appeal that we made to join the meeting in Bang Seng, that we were permitted to come. And so Rajaratnam showed up at the meeting in the beach resort. So we speak as an interloper that came in at the very last minute, but that's the story of Singapore's accession to ASEAN. As we have heard this morning already from Dr. Surin and the excellent panel from the morning, that ASEAN has achieved quite a fair bit, 50 years old, and there's much that we can celebrate and congratulate. Maybe these are some of the C's that certainly Chair has invited us to come up with. But that being said, I guess what I want to share, you know, is a bit of a cautionary note. That's another C, I suppose. And what I want to say is that despite all the achievements that ASEAN has made in those 5 decades, that indeed there are some very serious challenges. Challenges to its very integrity. I'm not suggesting that ASEAN is a moribund institution, not at all. And ASEAN is not about to die off or whatever, that you know, shouldn't even be said. But I think ASEAN faces some very hard, serious questions about its continued relevance to regional well-being, whether it can it deliver on the peace dividends, on the prosperity dividends that all of us as stakeholders of ASEAN aspire to. So these are some very serious questions, and I think to be able to do so in a way that respects the national priorities and that ASEAN countries, member countries hold dear to, and indeed also to be able to avoid the wholesale dependence on this great power, on that great power, at the expense of the freedom of ASEAN member countries. So these are very serious questions that ASEAN member countries and ASEAN itself must necessarily deal with. And the problems are well known, and we've heard this morning, and even Dr. Surin alluded in his speech to some of these issues as well. On the economic front, right, the ASEAN Economic Community Project, yes, we have welcomed the establishment, you know, but indeed the actual integration project itself has been deferred to 2025, thanks to, unfortunately, some of the more protectionist imperatives that we see amongst some of our member countries that's holding back progress. On the strategic front, ASEAN unity has been tested quite a fair bit in the last several years or so by big power rivalry, by the pressure that has placed on ASEAN member countries to choose sides. So that's been one of the stories as well. On the multilateral front, we also know there's been growing disenchantment over the perceived ineffectiveness and irrelevance of some of the ASEAN multilateral offshoots, right? I talk about the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, and so on and so forth. And ASEAN's inability to provide the requisite leadership to these institutions. And, you know, in a sense, right, you think about it, the Chinese initiatives that we have seen taking place, you know, the AIIB, the Belt and Road Initiative, Maritime Silk Road, indeed even China's own turn to institutions like the CICA or to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all these, I would suggest, presumably would reflect Beijing's unhappiness with the ASEAN-led regional architecture wherein Chinese purposes and aims and goals have been perceptibly opposed by the US, Japan, and so on and so forth. Right? Think with me, for example, right? We remember the spats that took place between the US and the Chinese over the South China Sea at the ARF meeting in 2010 in Hanoi, or indeed over disagreements between the Americans and the Japanese and with the Chinese over the US and Japan's attempts to import security issues into the agenda of the East Asia Summit, particularly cybersecurity. Now, all this brings me to my second observation, that is to say that the challenges that I've just highlighted also point to the fundamental conundrum facing ASEAN, and Dr. Term Sak alluded to this in his presentation earlier as well. On the one hand, historically, ASEAN's very weakness has indeed been our strength as well, right? Because big powers, regional powers, are quite comfortable with ASEAN taking the regional lead because ASEAN poses no threat to anyone, because we are weak, precisely. Right? On the other hand, with the great bargain or compact, if you will, amongst the great powers to give ASEAN the regional lead, with all this agreement weakening amongst the great powers because of the strategic rivalry between them, that all this also has shown that ASEAN's inability to lead the region in handling the key challenges in which the big powers themselves are invested, all that also has been actively exposed and created big problems for ASEAN itself. So indeed, it can be said that ASEAN, in fact, has effectively recused ourselves on being a strategic player as a result of our insistence on maintaining a passive neutrality and on relegating the ARF or the ADMM Plus, or indeed even the EAS, to the realm of non-traditional security issues, particularly the ARF and the ADMM Plus. So if you will, ASEAN appears to have disqualified itself from the grand strategic game, the great game. But that being said, I think this shortcoming on ASEAN's part is to be expected. Right? ASEAN is a weak institution. ASEAN has perceptibly overstretched ourselves in terms of what we can realistically accomplish, given the many limitations that are true of ASEAN. So it's a very tall order indeed, right? It is a bridge too far, if you allow me to say, that a grouping of small, of weak states, well, Indonesia is not exactly small, but no, I think we all share the same characteristics, and an institution whose key success hitherto has been limited to being a diplomatic community, to transforming itself into a vibrant economic and security community within a span of a decade plus, and a time when dialogue partners, external powers, are themselves engaged in strategic gamesmanship with one another, with the negative consequences that all that brings. This is all a big challenge. This is all a very, very complex issue, and it is with no wonder that ASEAN finds itself where we are today. And indeed, when you look at the big powers today, they are moving away from being public good providers to becoming transactional kinds of powers. We hear very much mention about President Donald Trump being a transactionalist, but I would argue that Southeast Asia, given our orientation with the great powers, in fact, are already in that age of transactionalism where short-term reciprocity is expected from the relationships, and indeed highly asymmetrical relationships at that. So that's just simply expecting too much from ASEAN. Can ASEAN deliver? Very difficult because of these circumstances. So going forward, I don't think I can go all the way to the next 50 years, but let me suggest a couple of things in at least the short to medium term. I think ASEAN's future relevance will depend on our perceived effectiveness as a manager of regional security. And perhaps the oft-heard dictum, the maxim that less is more, is something that ASEAN should take to heart. And what I mean by this is that what ASEAN should consider, perhaps, is in scaling back on some of our grand aims, some of our more grandiloquent goals and aspirations. It might better serve ASEAN, I want to suggest, to assume a more modest regional remit, one that's commensurable with the interests and with the capacities and with the wills of the respective member countries. Through taking these small but hopefully achievable steps, ASEAN perhaps could hopefully regain our momentum, regain our mojo, as it were, and be relevant. Finally, let me close with this point that ASEAN's future relevance, I suggest, will depend on our willingness to act proactively to stabilize and to secure its region. Again, we can't be expected to do too much, but we must at least attempt. So give me, for example, South China Sea, right? Where the South China Sea is concerned, a very, very complex, very difficult issue. Simply adopting a ASEAN-China approach is presumably insufficient, I would suggest. Even if ASEAN succeeds in persuading our Chinese friends to finally produce a code of conduct, a COC, I think it will likely be, I'm sure you agree with me, right? It will likely be a very diluted, watered down document, one very narrow, one non-binding, obviously, and it will be a Pyrrhic victory at the very best for ASEAN. What I suggest is that ASEAN should consider supplementing the aspiration to create a COC with the establishment of ad hoc informal coalitions of like-minded members for consultation and cooperation over the South China Sea. The basis for this is the ASEAN minus X principle, something that obviously has been utilized and appropriated in the economic realm, but I would suggest actually has a great deal of implication for security cooperation as well. And it doesn't necessarily contradict the consensus principle that ASEAN holds so very dear. Informal applications of the ASEAN minus X principle in the past have included, for example, the Malacca Straits Patrol that started with Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and later with Thailand coming on board as well. And we can also think of the ASEAN Convention on Counterterrorism, which entered into force in 2011 upon ratification by not 10 member countries, but by 6 member countries of ASEAN. So I think there are all these examples that we could point to that suggest that the ASEAN minus X principle has indeed been applied, if only informally, to ASEAN security cooperation. Now, considerably more complicated then ASEAN minus X is the prospect, I want to suggest, of perhaps an ASEAN minus X plus one or more arrangement. That is to say, a putative coalition of like-minded ASEAN states plus an external power or two. That being said, I think ASEAN's war on terrorism, of course, benefited from the support and assistance from external members like the Americans and like the Australians. So again, we've already been doing this sort of ASEAN minus X plus one kind of an approach in the past. Granted, when you're talking about terrorism, dealing with counterterrorism, dealing with anti-piracy, within the Southeast Asian context, all this is very much a different proposition than dealing with a big power, a hegemonic power like China, a very assertive big power on whom ASEAN members rely on for our economic well-being. But by proactively taking multiple approaches to the South China Sea and indeed to other kinds of security issues and challenges as they arise, I think ASEAN is indeed, in fact, exercising our very own centrality, something that we've been purporting for a long time. But I think we need these kinds of collective actions that may or may not involve all 10 ASEAN member countries, but it should be taken because the well-being of our region is at stake. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's very precise. So somebody might ask why you use letter C, because letter C has the homophone of C, S-E-A, yeah? Southeast Asia. So he proposed congratulations, caution, and challenges. I think it's quite very similar to what Dr. Termsak said from the first panel this morning. And still, we need to keep going. Yep. And this is from Singapore, who is usually blamed as they don't really pay attention to ASEAN. But it's proof that he quite, pay a lot of attention to ASEAN, that we suggested a lot of suggestions. I think I like this word that he just talked about, diplomatic community, right? It's quite true, right? When we talk about ASEAN as a forum that everybody come to talk, and let's listen to the Indonesian. What I think you represent your country, huh? So please give us, after Singapore, what would you say of the future of ASEAN? Not even 50 years, maybe the next decades. Please welcome Professor Shafa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Prapat and the organizers for giving me an opportunity to be here. Of course, I would like to start with an apology. Starting after lunch is difficult already, and now we got the difficult job to look at the future. Really sorry if I could not capture the whole story about the future. Well, because telling the story of the future is not like just telling that the future is bright, like in a motivation training, just like, oh, the lamp is bright, so our future is bright. But we have to make an educated guess for that. So I would like to start with a small part of that future. I would like to focus on the development in the Indian Ocean and how it will affect the future of ASEAN. So I would like to start with this postulate, the geopolitical postulate that geography is destiny. Yes, geography is destiny, but regions are not. Regions are political construction. We know Southeast Asia as a region as young as the World War. And before that, we do not identify this region as Southeast Asia. Before we look at this as a single entity known as the Asia in the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And when the World War happened, the Allied forces used the term Southeast Asia for the first time in their war efforts. So what I would like to say first is that since regions are political construction, the future of ASEAN will also be affected by the political dynamics within the region and within the countries of ASEAN. So geography is destiny, but regions are not. Then, because the challenge is to have the 3 C's, I would like to wrap this into 3 C's. I would like to talk about 3C today. The first C is the construction of region. This is the region as a political project. The construction of a region. How regions are constructed, and how, by putting this perspective, we can understand how the future of ASEAN will be affected. The second C is on the competing and complementing visions that mark the rise of Indian Ocean in its importance for ASEAN countries as well as East Asian countries and its surroundings. And the third C is what is the consequence, or what are the consequences for ASEAN. So I got the 3 C's. I'm waiting for the invitation to Phuket. Yeah?
Could you repeat again?
Yeah, the first is the construction of region. The second is the competing and complementing visions related to the Indian Ocean. And the third is the consequences for ASEAN.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the tickets to Phuket. Yeah, next, I would like to move to the first C. So what I would like to establish in the first C is that regions are politically constructed. We know this region not always as Southeast Asia. We know this region not always as a region unified by ASEAN. we understand as Asia in different meanings previously. During the colonial period, we have the idea of Pan-Asianism, which then later make an evolution into the greater Asia co-prosperity sphere. And then in the early post-colonial world, we understand Asia in terms of its opposition against colonial forces, against the established forces of the world. So we put Asia and Africa as an opposition of the old worlds. So Indonesia has the Ganevo, right? The new emerging forces vis-a-vis the old the old established forces, the old Devo. And then our understanding of Asia changed again with two competing visions of Asian solidarity promoted by some prominent leaders of Asia, including most prominently Dr. Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia, and the idea of Asia Pacific, which look at Asia as part of a larger region of Asia Pacific, which was promoted by Australia and Japan at the time. Then we also entered